Alright, welcome to the unit where we study what philosophers call the mind-body problem. And we're going to kick off this unit with a discussion about two different metaphysical theories. Dualism and materialism, found in the Cover-Giles reading as well as the Descartes selection. So here's a question. Is there life after death? Let me clarify. After your body has died and decayed, would you still exist? Let me revise this question one more time, just so I can get clear. The question, in a sense, is poorly formed initially. For once your body has died, there's just nothing left to ask. For as we just stated, the body is dead and is decaying. Here's another question. What would John Locke be doing if he were still alive? He'd be banging on his coffin. Here's the right question to ask. Is there anything that remains conscious or thinking or feeling after bodily death? Could one consciously survive one's bodily death? And that's kind of the question we're interested in answering today. And if I was in the physical classroom and I said, if the answer to this question was yes or no, you could all agree that that would be kind of a big deal, right? I mean, it's basically the question of, is there life after death? That's a question that has plagued humankind since the beginning. Well, if your answer is yes, that is, if you think after your bodily death, you still exist, you are still alive, you still survive, then you likely think that there's more to you than your physical body. So whatever it is that thinks or feels or understands and perceives isn't merely physical stuff. For once the physical stuff is gone, you somehow remain. But if your answer is no, then you likely believe that thinking, feeling, and perceiving, etc., is a physical process that ceases once the body dies. So this leads to a related question. Is it possible that there exists a non-physical thinking thing? Phrasing the question this way is somewhat controversial, for it assumes that there are, well, physical thinking things. So the question is what does the thinking? Is it possible that there is something that does the thinking that is non-physical? But, as I mentioned, it's also a controversial assumption that there are physical thinking things. In fact, that may not be as much of a controversial assumption in 2014, but throughout a lot of intellectual history. There are some very smart people, philosophers, that thought it was ridiculous that there be physical thinking things. So there's this philosopher Leibniz, who was a 17th century German philosopher, who gave the example of what is now known as Leibniz's mill. Suppose that physical things do thinking. So like machines think, for example. Well, suppose you were to walk into this really complicated machine, like a mill, and that machine is allegedly thinking. Well, where would you find the beliefs or the feelings? Like, I would see a bunch of gears moving, a bunch of parts swaying back and forth, pulleys and so on, but I wouldn't see any thoughts. So that's why it's a controversial assumption, or at least it has been throughout most of intellectual history, and a lot of very smart people have thought that it wasn't even possible. Now I think the converse is true. Now that people think that non-physical thinking things is ridiculous. But just because people think that these days doesn't mean they're right. Just because it's the current trend to hold a certain viewpoint doesn't mean that you've somehow progressed towards the truth. There are lots of things that are fashionable to believe at a time, and where people high-five themselves and pat themselves on the back for making progress that turned out to be false later. One example would be eugenics. Okay, so moving along. There's a related second question. Can a machine think? This is a question that's really of interest right now to cognitive scientists, to computer scientists, to researchers in artificial intelligence, as well as philosophers. In fact, the project of artificial intelligence, if you study the history of it, was kind of like all four of those fields working together, and it's still all four of these disciplines are working together in it. I've been to artificial intelligence conferences. I know a lot of people working in that field, and philosophy is indispensable in it. So To answer the question of whether or not a machine can think, we have to get clear on thinking and feeling and believing, etc. Well, certainly you could make a computer that makes the ouch sound if you poke the computer with a needle. In fact, you could have a computer that looks like a human being or some other living organism. It's furry or whatever, and when you prick it, it screams ouch in such a way that you might be deceived into thinking that it's a thinking or feeling thing. Computers can also say yes if you ask, do you understand me? But that doesn't necessarily mean that the computer was really in pain or that it actually understood you. So just because a computer says ouch or yes doesn't mean it's actually in pain. It doesn't entail that the computer is actually conscious. And that's important. Something can act as if it were conscious. It can deceive you even though we know it's not. So anyone might remember the movie Weekend at Bernie's. Most of you probably won't. It was a movie from the 80s, early 90s, I think, where this guy, Bernie, dies. And these two guys have to somehow convince a bunch of people that Bernie's alive and well. So they take this corpse, basically, and then treat it like a puppet. So if you're 50 meters away and you wave at this corpse, they'll pull a string and the corpse will wave back at you. So if you're 50 meters away, you'll be deceived into thinking that the corpse is alive. Well, a lot of machines can do that now. We can make machines act in such a way as if they were alive, as if they understand you, as if they feel pain. The question is, are they actually? Could we actually make a machine that actually feels pain, actually understands you, and so on? So we need to distinguish then between responding in a thinking-like way to responding in a way that actually results from understanding, or from responding in a feeling in pain-like way, from responding in a way that actually arises from being in pain. Two different notions. Which, of course, a lot of science fiction assumes that, addresses this stuff. So in some science fiction, the robots actually do understand and feel pain, like Marvin from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Whereas in other, such as Star Trek The Next Generation, Data really doesn't. But it's a big, it's an interesting plot line of the show, whether or not he is, really emotional, really understands you, really feels pain, and so on. So it's interesting terrain. Well, there's an argument that says that machines cannot think, cannot understand, cannot feel, cannot perceive. It's called the Chinese room argument. So let me explain this scenario. And I'll quote the philosopher John Searle, who introduced this argument. So imagine a native English speaker who knows no Chinese and is locked in a room full of boxes of Chinese symbols. We'll call that the database. Together with a book of instructions for manipulating the symbols, we'll call it the program. Imagine that people outside the room send in other Chinese symbols which, unknown to the person in the room, are questions in Chinese. We'll call that the input. And imagine that by following the instructions in the program, the man in the room is able to pass out Chinese symbols, which are correct answers to the questions. We'll call that the output. The program then enables the person in the room to pass what philosophers call the Turing test for understanding Chinese, but he does not actually understand the word Chinese. So if you're outside the room that guy is, and you would feed this room questions in Chinese, and it would output answers in Chinese, you would think that that room is actually understanding you. When in reality, it's not. That guy doesn't know a lick of Chinese. Well, here's an example. So we want to say this person understands Chinese, even though he's giving correct answers in Chinese to questions asked in Chinese. So he could fool a lot of people. Well, John Searle thinks that machines are like that. Machines can't actually understand or feel or think or perceive. They just manipulate symbols according to certain rules. We input a bunch of symbols into our keyboard and it outputs symbols to the screen. And it might output ouch or hello or hi or how are you doing or I understand. But it's just a bunch of symbols being manipulated according to certain rules. Which is not what we do when we are thinking. We understand what the symbols actually mean. You understand what I'm saying right now, for example. And if I were to speak with you in person, I would understand you. So let's clarify some terms and questions then. Moving back to the question of, is there something, this you, perhaps that is non-physical, that could survive death? And by the way, this argument, so, So we'll say by material or physical, we'll mean objects that take up space, that are publicly observable, with one or more of the five senses, have mass, and are governed by the laws of nature. So physical objects, apples, ducks, brains. By asking then if machines can think, we are asking about the possibility of a machine, a physical object, thinking. This is different from another question. Do, as a matter of fact, machines think? Right now, current machines do not, but that's contingently true. But the question is it necessarily true that machines cannot think? Is it possible that in the future we will make machines that actually really think? There are a lot of people working really hard to make that happen. The question is it possible? So what we're asking then is, even if there are no machines in this world right now that think, is it possible that there could be machines that think? And asking this second question requires getting clear on the concepts of thought and matter. So we're going to have to do some conceptual analysis. That boring lecture I did on conceptual analysis actually gets to be used for some really interesting stuff then. Hooray! So, two different views in dualism and materialism. We'll start with dualism. One who contends that thinking can only be explained by positing something non-physical would be called a dualist. They would say that there's a non-physical stuff that thinks, that wills, and believes, and feels, and we'll call that a mental substance, or we'll call it the mind. And as traditionally conceived, mental thingies are non-spatial. How much does a thought weigh? How many inches long is a thought, for example? Now they are temporal, they're in time. A thought can have a duration of time that it exists, for example, but they're not spatial in any way. Unlike, say, a neuron. A neuron has a definite weight, a definite size, a definite length. Okay. Mental objects can only be experienced by you. No one else can experience your pain or have your belief. That is, you have private access to your mental states. In contrast, physical objects are spatial and publicly observable. So, now, if you're in pain and you scream, "Ouch, I'm in pain," we can see you behaving the way that we ourselves behave when we're in pain, but your behavior isn't the same thing as the pain. The pain is this inner subjective thing that you experience. Your physical bodily behavior is caused by the pain. It's an effect of the pain. And that is what we publicly observe, but it's not the same thing as your pain. You can report your thoughts to us by saying them out loud or writing them, but that is not your actual thought. That is an expression of your thought. Your thought, though, the actual thinking, is something that only you have access to. So there's something very first person about mental states and about objects of those states. There's something very private, subjective. It's access to only one. So then the dualist claims that only non-physical mental substances can think or be conscious. It's impossible to explain fully the activity of thinking in terms of physical objects and their features. If you try to give a complete physical description of the world, then would be incomplete because it would leave out mental non-physical stuff. If you want to give a complete description of the world, but you only have physical stuff in it, then you're going to have an incomplete description. That's the dualism. So we'll call that the dualist thesis. There are non-physical mental substances and physical substances, and everything that exists is either mental or physical. So a complete description of the world has physical and non-physical mental things in it. This is in contrast with materialism. The materialist holds that anything singled out as mental can be explained in terms of physical objects, states, and processes. We don't need this other weird, ectoplasmic, distinct, non-physical mental thingy. Instead, a complete physical description of the universe would include reference to your beliefs, thoughts, and feelings and experiences, because your beliefs, thoughts, feelings, and experiences are physical, according to a materialist. So a complete physical description of the universe is a complete description of the universe. So a materialist thinks that everything that exists is mental. So your beliefs and thoughts and feelings then are, the materialist thinks that everything that exists is material. So your beliefs, thoughts, and feelings then are, well, like everything else, they're material. So if you were to walk into that mill, that machine that is allegedly thinking, some of those moving pulleys might just be your thoughts then. So this is the materialist thesis. There's only one kind of substance in the world, and it is a physical substance. So the mind-body problem is really a question about what exists. What is there out there? What kinds of things are there that exist? And there's two different answers given based on who you ask. So let's do a quick review then. The dualist thesis holds that there are non-physical mental substances and there are physical substances. And everything that exists is either mental or physical. And mental substances are not identical to material substances. So your mind is not identical to your brain. The materialist thesis, on the other hand, says that there is really just one kind of substance in the world, and it's physical. And they have a response to dualism. If there's only one kind of substance in the world, and it's physical, then the mind can't be non-physical. So, the mind is the brain. It's numerically identical to the brain. So here's an important point. The materialist who denies that there are non-physical substances is committed to holding that the mind is identical to the brain. This is an identity claim. So the materialist holds that the mind is the brain, and vice versa. Further, most materialists maintain that individual thoughts and beliefs, etc., are identical to individual brain states. So your belief that Chicago is in Illinois is identical to a brain state, such as a cluster of neurons firing. Your mental image of an elephant is also identical to some neurons firing. So, materialists also hold the thesis that all mental states are identical to brain states. Those are two important theses, or implications, of the materialist thesis. Well, we need to talk about identity then, for a minute. Because identity / sameness can be said in many ways, and we need to be clear on just what we mean by identity. So, for example, my iPhone is the same kind of iPhone as my wife's. We both have the iPhone 5, same color, same amount of memory. However, I won't say that I have literally the exact same iPhone as my wife's. Mine's in my pocket, my wife's iPhone's on her desk. We have the same case, same music, etc. But even if we had, all the same apps, it wouldn't be literally identical to each other. They'd be two different iPhones. Just the same model, for example. Well, suppose that this morning I played a game on my iPhone. Then as I was getting ready to leave, I left my iPhone on my wife's desk and accidentally placed hers in my pocket. When I arrived on campus, I would say that it wasn't the same iPhone I was playing the game on this morning, even though it was the same brand, same shape, and so on, etc. So, they're not what philosophers say is numerically identical. So when I say that the iPhone I now have is not the same as the one I was using this morning, what I mean is that the iPhone I have now is not numerically identical to the phone I had this morning. It's an important term, numerical identity. What do I mean by that? Well, this is the stricter sense of identity that we're going to be dealing with when we look at the materialist thesis that the mind is identical to the brain and that mental states are identical to brain states. If two things are numerically identical, then they're really just one thing. Okay? If x is numerically identical to y, then if you're asked how many things there are when you count x and y, you just say one. Because they're the same thing. Okay? So if we were to count iPhones, my wife's iPhone and my iPhone would be two things, because they're not numerically identical to each other. But my own iPhone is numerically identical to itself. So if I were to say how many things are there, I'd say one. It's important. Sounds kind of weird, but it's important. So here's another example. Suppose I'm looking at a painting in a museum, and my wife is looking at a duplicate painting in another museum. There's two paintings then, not one. They then are not numerically identical. But if we were both at the same museum, in the same room, looking at the same painting, then the number of paintings we would be looking at would be one. Then that would be numerically identical. All right. Enough of this obvious point. So, how does this relate to materialism? Well, let me explain. The philosopher Leibniz had what he called a law of identity. It's not an empirical test to find out if two things are one thing. Instead, it's a criteria that must be satisfied for something to be numerically identical to something. It's a necessary condition, if you recall the lecture on conceptual analysis. So it's a necessary condition for numerical identity. And it can be expressed this way. If x is numerically identical to y, and that's what that equal sign means. So if x is numerically identical to y, then x and y have all the same properties. which means that everything true of X will also be true of Y. So let's apply this to the example of the paintings. Recall the example of me looking at a painting in the Museum of St. Chicago and my wife looking at an exact duplicate of the painting but while she's in Paris. Well, are those two paintings numerically identical? Well, one painting's in Chicago and the other's in Paris. Then they can't be numerically identical because there's something true of the painting in Chicago that's not true of the painting in Paris, and vice versa. Mainly, that painting's in Chicago and the other painting's in Paris. So, even though they're qualitatively similar, they're not numerically identical. And this can be expressed in this simple argument. If X is numerically identical to Y, then X and Y have all the same properties. Everything true of X will be true of Y. Leibniz's law. The painting Davis is looking at is in Chicago, and the painting Davis's wife is looking at is in Paris. And I should add, at the same time. Premise 3. So, there is something true of the painting Davis is looking at that is not true of the painting Davis's wife is looking at, and vice versa. Well, the conclusion then. So, the painting Davis is looking at is not identical to the painting Davis's wife is looking at by Leibniz's law. It's a pretty straightforward, trivial, obvious argument. I think that we've known this all along. This is something we all assume. But recall, the materialist denies that mental substances are non-physical. So if mental substances are non-physical, then they must be physical. So the mind then will be numerically the same thing as the brain. The mind is numerically identical to the brain. And if the mind is numerically identical to the brain, then the mind and the brain are really one thing with just different names attached to it. Okay? Alright. Well, take your belief or mental image. Take your beliefs in mental images. They must be numerically the same thing as neurons firing, as different parts of the brain or different brain states. So, for example, your mental image of an elephant and a group of neurons firing are really one thing. They're numerically identical. So says the materialist, or so is the materialist committed. Well, as the materialist then makes this numerical identity claim that the mind and brain, as well as individual thoughts and brain states are numerically identical, then, well, it must satisfy Leibniz's law. Well, dualists are going to argue that it doesn't satisfy Leibniz's law, in which case it can't be numerically identical. So here's the argument. Premise 1. If materialism, then all mental states are numerically identical to brain states. And that's the materialist thesis. Premise 2. If all mental states are numerically identical to brain states, then the mind and the brain have all the same properties. So everything true of the mind will also be true of the brain. That's Leibniz's law. Premise 3. My mental image of a green elephant has green colors, tusks, and a trunk-like shapes, and resembles a four-footed creature. And my brain state that occurs when forming the mental image of a green elephant does not have green colors, tusk, trunk, etc. So it does not resemble a four-footed creature. So a little thought experiment real quick. Close your eyes and imagine a green elephant. Look at it. Study it. Okay. Now. Alright. Good. Now that you've established the properties of this mental image you formed, compare it to brain stuff. Alright? Well, premise 4. There are some things then true of my mental image of a green elephant that are not true of the brain state that occurs when I form a mental image of a green elephant. And I should add vice versa. My mental image of an elephant isn't shaped like a neuron firing, and the neuron firing isn't shaped like a green elephant or colored like an elephant. Well, premise 5. By Leibniz's law, not all mental states are numerically identical to brain states. But remember, a theoretical commitment of materialism is that mental states are numerically identical to brain states. So, by Leibniz's law, materialism is false. That's the argument.